We encourage African governments to promote policies to shift to value-added sectors or invest in industries, technological advancements to develop the manufacturing and services industries to become more competitive at the global scale.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week, we're looking at Africa's economies and ways to boost trade, reduce risk, and unlock the continent's potential. From global economic turbulence to the impact of climate change, UN Trade and Development's latest report on Africa says much of the continent struggles to get ahead due to repeated exposure to external shocks. Its economies are particularly vulnerable because they rely heavily on commodity exports, carry high levels of debt, and have limited technology infrastructure. According to the just-released Economic Development in Africa report, key steps forward include wider diversification of economies, greater regional trade, and a more robust regulatory environment. For the continent of 1.4 billion people, moving up into higher value areas of the global supply chain is also vital to building resilience and supporting sustainable development. Well, for more on the report and its recommendations, I'm joined now by Mona Badran from the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University. Mona is also an international digital economy expert. And also joining me is UN Trade and Development's Chief of Africa section and lead author of the report, Habiba Barka. Well, welcome to the show, ladies. It's great to have you here this morning. So looking at Africa, it has a wealth of resources and people. So why is the continent still struggling to take advantage of its potential, Habiba?
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning to you and Mona. As you mentioned, it's right that Africa has a wealth of natural resources and wealth of people resources, and that provides the continent with immense potential for its economic transformation. Africa has a wealth of reserves in terms of copper, in terms of manganese and cobalt, which are critical minerals that are essential in the technological transformation, but also in the global call to lower carbon emission in the world. Africa also has a wealth of human capital. It has today's represent almost close to a quarter of the world population, and it has a huge, dynamic and growing young population, which are called upon to basically transform the economies of tomorrow on the continent. So those advantages that African countries can leverage on to become more competitive in the global markets. However, many countries are not able to capitalize on those wealth, on those advantages, because they face significant challenges. It can be structural challenges. It can be challenges related to shocks, external factors such as external shocks or global crises that we've been experiencing in the past years. You remember the impact, the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, how it has impacted African countries in terms of border closure, in terms of low demand on some of the products that they export, or in terms of high borrowing costs in the global markets, because it's impacted all global markets. And let's also remember that, or note that African countries are heavily dependent on low value added products. So when they export raw materials, the products are not necessarily very attractive to all markets, to specific markets, and they may not necessarily generate significant revenues that can be reinvested into the economies or reinvested for economic transformation. So many African countries are not able to leverage on some of the natural resources wealth or human capital wealth that they currently have, which could basically be better used for economic transformation, but also for the competitiveness of African economies in the global markets.
Mona, you're in Egypt. What are you seeing across the continent?
Thank you, Sarah and Habiba, for having me. I believe, Sarah, that low levels of education and backward social norms and lack of awareness are all challenges that, together with the geopolitical tensions that Habiba mentioned and political instabilities that face the continent, all are leading to be considered as critical impediments in the African context and lead to mass migration within Africa. This mass migration results in not only problems in the original countries, but in the host countries as well, where the host countries are experiencing pressure on their resources, on their utilities, and on their services. So this leads to general decline in growth rates in African continent in general. This is one shock that has been emphasized in the report, the geopolitical tensions and the political instability. Also, another shock or another important impediment in the African continent is the technological change. So despite the fact that the technology has been regarded as a catalyst for growth in developing countries, we notice that the African countries are not really prepared for the fourth industrial revolution and technological transformation. So this poses a great impediment to them embracing digital economy. The demand for labor will face challenges due to the AI uptake in Africa in the medium and in the long term, but not immediately. And this could be regarded as an advantage and for the African continent, so they can really learn from the experiences of other countries of how to tackle the AI threat for the labor market.
Habiba, Mona talked about some of the vulnerabilities. Africa is, of course, huge and diverse, but what do you see are the biggest vulnerabilities that must be addressed to reduce the impact of shocks and crises?
It's not only to look at Africa's exposure to the global shocks that we have analyzed under this report, but it's also to look at the different vulnerabilities to respond to those shocks. And we measure those vulnerabilities across 6 domains: economic, political, social, energy, connectivity, and climate change. African countries have significant vulnerabilities across all 6 domains that basically reduces their ability or impact the ability to respond to the global shocks. Also, we analyze some of the impact that they face during the recent crisis, such as the COVID or the war in Ukraine, that has basically reduced market demand for some of the commodities that African countries are most reliant on, including oil, gas, and other minerals. And because of those global shocks that have impacted the price of those commodities, African countries were not able basically to mobilize enough revenues out of those commodities, which has impacted basically the overall financial ability for some of the impact of the shock, or even to continue investing into the sustainable development programs, also its connectivity. And we looked at connectivity from the point of view of infrastructure, transport, and it can be also technological infrastructure. And coming down to transport, infrastructure, and energy, for instance, the fact that many African countries have really low levels of those type of infrastructure, it impacts not only productivity in the country, but it also impacts intra-African trade. And the reason we brought intra-African trade into this report is that it could be a buffer basically for African countries to mitigate some of the impact of global market disruptions, where they can rely more on regional markets and reduce the dependence on global markets that may be affected by some of those global shocks.
But how can we make these countries more resilient and really encourage trade and investment so countries can really see the benefits there?
That's a very good question. And we really dive into some of those policy aspects in the report, where we looked at some of the actionable policies or strategies or programs or initiatives that African countries can put in place to make sure that the economies become more resilient. For instance, to make the economies more diversified and more resilient, not only domestic economies, but also regional economies. And so we encourage, for instance, African governments to promote or leverage policies that will facilitate industry to shift progressively to value-added sectors, or invest into agro-processing industries, technological advancements, or IC-related services, because this would enable African countries to develop the manufacturing and services industries, and enable them to become more competitive at the global scales. It's also not only policies for industries or for regional integration or intra-African trade, but it's also the vulnerability or the the need for resilience that the African private sector needs to build. And as we know, in a lot of developing countries, the SMEs, what we call the small and medium-sized enterprises, are the backbone of most economies in the developing world, including in Africa. So we also make recommendations in terms of how they operate their businesses, how they improve the productivity, how they trade more within Africa, but also how they can partner with other larger firms to trade within the global markets.
Mona, what would you add to what Habiba's just said?
Thank you, Sarah. I believe that there are several factors that could reduce the impact of shocks and vulnerabilities in the African continent. These factors include solid regulations, harnessing human capital and education, empowering and catering to SMEs and entrepreneurship, fostering new technologies and innovations as a catalyst for economic growth and development. We noticed that indeed there are many countries, African countries such as Egypt, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and many more are trying to leverage these disruptive technologies such as digital platforms, edutech, fintech, health tech, and AI, all these new technologies to accelerate their development agendas. What African countries need is the appropriate country-specific regulatory framework to govern these disruptive technologies in their best interest. There is the big share of youth to total population in the African continent, which is called the youth bulge. Africa should leverage that and should be considered as a major asset. Also, cross-border interactions in Africa is crucial, not only cross-border in trade, but also cross-border payment. And we notice that, for example, it is critical to leverage fintech to solve cross-border payment and provide digital payment solutions.
Habiba, Mona has some recommendations. What elements would you add from the report?
I think it would be good for government to look at how do they prioritize the development of regional value and supply chains. And that's not only the role of African governments, but also regional economic communities, regional institutions, and also global partners to make sure that basically African products become competitive and marketable within the sub-region, but also at the global scale. So African industries, businesses could be supplier of not only raw material as we know it now, they could be suppliers of value-added products or more competitive products and services. They could also have better facilities in terms of transportation, logistics, and they could also be able to better match the demand or the capacity in terms of financing capacity of the consumer base on the continent. So that will also require then more progress in terms of implementing the regional integration agenda on the continent, which is under the umbrella of the African Free Trade Agreement. Another thing, it will be important to make sure that there's more collaboration, there's more skills transfer, there's more partnership that will facilitate also the access of African economies, African industries, African private sector to some of the de-risking mechanisms that they can tap into to lower the risk of all the shocks, the impact of the global shocks, but also to make sure that they are basically produce better, export more competitively, and are able to basically play a bigger role in the global markets.
Thank you for telling us more about the report. That was UNCTAD and Development's Habiba Barka and also Mona Badran at Cairo University. And there's even more on our website at UNCTAD.org. I'm Sarah Thomas in Geneva. Goodbye for now.